I didn't realize how fragile trust could be until my husband got sick. At first it looked like exhaustion, long hours, missed meals, a quiet man growing quieter. Then my mother-in-law stepped in calm and decisive, saying she knew exactly what he needed. She invited his ex to help care for him. She said it was practical, temporary, harmless. I told myself not to overthink it. The house changed after that. Conversations lowered. Doors stayed closed longer. My husband slept more, spoke less, and looked at me like he was trying to remember something he'd lost. Every time I asked, I was told it was part of the treatment, part of healing. Then I saw the prescription. It was just paper and ink. A name, a dosage, a signature. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I folded it carefully and put it back where I found it, my hands steady, my heart not. I didn't know then that this quiet moment, this single prescription, would become the beginning of a truth no one wanted revealed. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, tell me your location and local time in the comments. And if stories of quiet strength and late justice speak to you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. Before my husband got sick, our marriage moved at a steady, almost invisible pace. We weren't the kind of couple people noticed. No loud arguments, no dramatic reconciliations, no social media declarations of love. Just routines, just responsibility. Just two adults building something quietly and believing that quiet meant safe. My husband's name is Daniel. He's 39, born and raised in Illinois, the kind of man who learned early that keeping the peace was more valuable than being right. I'm Claire. I'm 36. We've been married for 7 years and living in a 3-bedroom house in a suburban neighborhood about 40 miles outside Chicago. Tree-lined streets. Lawns trimmed on weekends. Neighbors who wave but don't ask questions. Daniel worked as a senior project coordinator for a national logistics company. His salary was solid, dependable, the kind that made spreadsheets predictable. I worked remotely as a compliance analyst, reviewing contracts and regulatory filings for a consulting firm. My job trained me to notice inconsistencies, to read the fine print, to trust documentation more than people's reassurance. But at home I didn't live that way. At home I trusted feelings. I trusted family. Daniel's mother Margaret had always been a constant presence in our lives. Not aggressive, not openly controlling. Just permanent. She lived alone in a retirement community, about 20 miles away, and called every Sunday evening at exactly 7 p.m. She remembered dates, names, and grievances with remarkable precision. Daniel listened to her with an obedience that never seemed intentional. It was simply how he'd been raised. She sacrificed a lot for me, he'd say whenever I hinted that her influence felt heavy. I owe her. I never challenged that word, owe. I didn't want to be the woman who came between a son and his mother. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be seen as emotional or insecure. So I learned to step back, to let Margaret's opinions pass through our home like weather. Temporary, harmless. That balance held until Daniel's health began to fail. At first it was subtle. He'd come home exhausted, not the normal end-of-day tiredness, but a deeper kind, like his body was heavier than it should be. He forgot small things, where he parked, whether he'd eaten lunch. He laughed it off. I laughed with him. Stress, we said. Long hours. Too many meetings. Then the headaches started. They weren't dramatic enough to send us to the emergency room, but persistent enough to worry me. He'd sit on the edge of the bed in the mornings, rubbing his temples, eyes closed. I suggested a doctor. He resisted. He hated hospitals, hated being poked and measured. Margaret noticed before he agreed to do anything. You look pale, she said during one of her visits, studying him like a chart. This isn't normal fatigue. She called again the next day. And the day after that. By the time Daniel finally scheduled an appointment with his primary care physician, Margaret had already taken on the role of overseer. She asked for test results. She wanted updates. She offered advice I hadn't asked for. The doctor ran blood work, neurological checks. Everything came back mostly unremarkable. Rest, hydration, reduced stress, follow-up if symptoms persisted. Daniel was relieved. I was cautious. Margaret was dissatisfied. This kind of thing doesn't just happen, she said, sitting at our kitchen table one afternoon while Daniel napped on the couch. There's always a cause. She started coming over more often after that, bringing food, rearranging the pantry, folding laundry that wasn't hers to touch. She spoke with authority, as if proximity alone gave her decision-making power. I thanked her. Every time. Then one evening, while stirring her tea, she introduced the idea that changed everything. "I may have found a solution," she said casually, as if she were suggesting a new brand of vitamins. I looked up. What kind of solution? Someone to help take care of him. Properly. At home. I felt a tightening in my chest. "We can look into licensed home care services." Margaret shook her head. "Why involve strangers when someone he already trusts is available?" I already knew. My stomach dropped before she said the name. Emily. Margaret continued. "His ex. She used to work as an LPN. She knows his medical history. She's between positions right now. It just makes sense." The word sense landed like a verdict. I looked at Daniel. He was awake now, leaning back against the couch, cushions, eyes tired, posture defeated. He didn't meet my gaze. "I don't think that's appropriate," I said carefully. "There are boundaries." Margaret smiled, patient and disappointed. "This isn't about feelings, Claire. This is about Daniel's health." Daniel sighed. "It's temporary," he said quietly. "Just until I'm better." That was the moment I chose not to fight. Not because I agreed, but because everything about him looked fragile. His voice, his posture, his patience. I told myself that objecting would only add stress. That being a good wife meant absorbing discomfort for the greater good. Emily arrived 2 days later. She was composed, professional, and almost unnervingly calm. Hair pulled back neatly, neutral scrubs, a soft voice that never rose or wavered. She greeted Daniel warmly as if no time had passed. She acknowledged me with a polite nod, nothing more. Margaret hovered beside her, approving, attentive, almost proud. Emily took notes, asked questions, reviewed medications. She spoke in medical terms that made her sound unquestionably competent. Margaret deferred to her immediately. Daniel did too. And just like that, the center of care in my own home shifted away from me. Emily organized medication schedules. Margaret coordinated appointments. Decisions were made in quiet conversations I wasn't invited into. I still cooked, cleaned, worked, paid bills, but my role had become logistical, not essential. At night, I lay awake listening to Daniel's breathing, staring at the ceiling, telling myself this was temporary. That silence was strength. That patience was love. I didn't yet understand that silence once established is easily mistaken for consent. Daniel's condition didn't improve after Emily arrived. If anything, the house grew heavier, as if the air itself had learned to hold its breath. Days blurred together, measured not by time but by medication schedules taped neatly to the refrigerator, Emily's handwriting precise and clinical. Margaret reviewed it every morning when she came by, nodding in approval, as if oversight alone could heal him. Daniel stopped going into the office entirely. At first, he worked remotely, logging in from the couch with his laptop balanced on his knees. Then even that became too much. His company approved medical leave, generous but temporary. I handled the paperwork, scanned forms, tracked deadlines. I was good at that. It was something I could control. What I couldn't control was how quickly my husband began to disappear from conversations. He slept longer hours. When he was awake, his attention drifted. He'd start a sentence and lose it halfway through, eyes unfocused, words dissolving into silence. Emily would step in smoothly, guiding him back to bed, adjusting pillows, speaking to him in a low, reassuring tone that sounded intimate in ways that unsettled me. "Let him rest," she'd say when I lingered too long. "His brain needs quiet." Margaret echoed her. "Always." "You worry too much," she told me one afternoon, as I hovered in the doorway of the bedroom. "This is why it's good we have someone experienced here." Experienced. That word followed me around the house. I noticed how often Margaret and Emily spoke privately, in the kitchen, on the back patio, in hushed tones that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. When I asked questions, the answers were vague but confident. "The dosage was adjusted," Emily said once, flipping through her notebook. "That's normal." "The doctor approved it," Margaret added, even when I hadn't asked. Which doctor, I wondered. Daniel's primary care physician hadn't changed anything at our last appointment. In fact, he'd recommended caution with medications, minimal intervention until more tests were done. But the new prescriptions kept appearing. They were slipped into pharmacy bags, placed carefully in the medicine cabinet, logged onto the schedule. I saw names I didn't recognize. Drugs with long, complicated syllables. Dosages that increased gradually, subtly, just enough to make questioning feel dramatic. When I asked Emily directly, she smiled. "Don't worry," she said. "This is all within safe limits." Margaret watched me closely when Emily said that, as if gauging whether I'd accept the reassurance or push further. I accepted it. Again, Daniel trusted them. That was the hardest part. He trusted his mother because he always had. He trusted Emily because she spoke with certainty at a time when his own mind felt unreliable. And when I hesitated, when my voice carried even a hint of doubt, he looked at me with confusion, sometimes irritation. "Why are you making this harder?" he asked me one evening, after I suggested calling his doctor again. "They're helping." I backed down immediately. I apologized. The shift in our marriage was quiet but devastating. I became the person who asked questions, and they became the people with answers. I was the emotional one. They were the rational ones. I felt myself being repositioned in the narrative of his care from partner to obstacle. Margaret leaned into that role with practiced ease. "She means well," she said to Emily once, not quietly enough. "She's just overwhelmed." It sounded kind. It felt dismissive. One afternoon I came home from a brief walk around the block, my attempt at clearing my head, to find Emily sitting at our dining table with a stack of papers spread out neatly in front of her. Margaret sat beside her, reading glasses perched low on her nose. "What's this?" I asked. "Medical directives," Margaret said without looking up. "Just making sure everything is in order." My pulse quickened. "What kind of directives?" "Routine things," Emily replied smoothly. "Power of attorney. Emergency contacts. In case his condition worsens." I looked at Daniel. He sat on the couch, distant, compliant, nodding faintly as if this were all reasonable. I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a breath. "I'm his wife," I said quietly. "Shouldn't I be part of that conversation?" Margaret finally looked at me, then her expression, patient but firm. "Of course, but you're emotional right now. This needs to be handled calmly." Handled. As if my marriage were a task. I retreated. Again. That night I lay awake, replaying every moment, every word I hadn't said. I told myself that confronting them would only make me look unstable. That waiting was smarter. That silence could still protect me if I used it carefully. The next morning I found the prescription. It was folded neatly on the kitchen counter, placed there deliberately, I realized later. Not hidden, not highlighted, just present enough to be seen. I picked it up while the house was quiet. Daniel was asleep. Margaret hadn't arrived yet. Emily was in the shower. I read it slowly. The medication was one I recognized, not from personal experience but from my work. It was a controlled substance, sometimes used off-label, requiring careful monitoring. The dosage listed was higher than what was typically prescribed for Daniel's reported symptoms, and the prescribing physician's name wasn't his primary care doctor. I checked the signature. Then I checked it again. Something about it felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just inconsistent, like a detail that didn't belong. My heart began to race, but my hands stayed steady. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back exactly where I'd found it. No one needed to know I'd seen it. Not yet. When Emily emerged from the hallway, I was standing at the sink, washing a mug that was already clean. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Fine." Margaret arrived shortly after, cheerful, confident, as if nothing in the world could possibly be amiss. I went to my home office and closed the door. I opened my laptop and began searching, not frantically, methodically. Drug names, dosage ranges, prescribing requirements. I didn't draw conclusions. I gathered information. By the time Daniel woke up that afternoon, I had learned enough to know one thing for certain. That prescription deserved questions. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood that my silence could no longer be passive. If I stayed quiet now, it wouldn't be patience. It would be permission. After I found the prescription, I changed the way I moved through my own house. I still spoke softly. I still nodded when Margaret spoke with that measured authority that suggested she was always 10 steps ahead. I still thanked Emily for her help, but inside something had shifted. I stopped reacting and started watching. Emily's presence became more constant. She arrived early in the morning and often stayed until evening, even on days when Daniel slept almost the entire time. She moved through the house with familiarity that bordered on entitlement, opening drawers without asking, adjusting the thermostat, answering Daniel's phone when it buzzed beside him. Margaret encouraged it. "She knows what he needs," she said when I questioned why Emily needed to be there so late. Consistency is important. Consistency, I learned, meant control. Daniel grew more dependent on her with each passing day. He deferred to her about when to eat, when to rest, when to take medication. When I offered suggestions, he hesitated, glanced toward Emily, and waited for her confirmation. It was subtle, but it hurt more than outright rejection. One afternoon, I suggested he take a short walk with me around the block. Fresh air, movement. Emily smiled sympathetically. That might overstimulate him right now. Margaret nodded. Better not risk it. Daniel looked relieved to be told no. I felt ridiculous arguing against people who claimed expertise, especially when my husband seemed too tired to advocate for himself. So I didn't argue. I stepped back. I let the pattern continue, even as it carved distance between us. The boundaries in my marriage blurred until they were barely visible. Emily started staying over occasionally when Daniel had what she called rough nights. Margaret insisted it was safer that way. I slept alone in the guest room more often, told it was better for Daniel's recovery. Less noise, less disruption. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was being mature. But there were moments, small, sharp moments that cut through my rationalizations. Like the time I walked into the living room unexpectedly and found Emily sitting close to Daniel on the couch, her hand resting on his arm. Not clinical, not necessary, just familiar. She moved it immediately when she saw me. Sorry, she said lightly. He was feeling anxious. Daniel didn't look at me. Or the time I heard them laughing softly in the kitchen while I worked upstairs, a sound I hadn't heard from Daniel in weeks. When I came down, the laughter stopped, replaced by the careful quiet that followed me everywhere now. Margaret noticed everything, especially me. You look tired, she said one morning, her tone sweet but observant. You should take better care of yourself. It sounded like concern. It felt like a warning. I started keeping notes, not dramatic ones, not accusatory, just dates, times, medication names, changes in dosage, how Daniel reacted after taking them, how often Emily administered them instead of me, how frequently Margaret was present when decisions were made. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask for explanations. I became invisible on purpose. Emily and Margaret grew more comfortable as my objections disappeared. They stopped guarding their conversations as carefully. I overheard fragments financial worries Emily mentioned in passing Margaret's reassurances that things would work out. Work out how? One evening, after Daniel had been asleep for hours, Margaret stayed late. Emily was packing up her things when I heard Margaret say, "We're doing the right thing. He needs stability." Emily hesitated. "I just don't want this to get complicated." Margaret laughed softly. "It won't. Not if everyone stays calm." I stood at the top of the stairs, heart pounding and visible once again. That night I couldn't sleep. I replayed every detail, every subtle shift I'd ignored. I thought about the prescription folded neatly on the counter, about the unfamiliar doctor's name, about the way Daniel's confusion deepened after each dosage increase. The next morning, I made an excuse to run errands and drove to the pharmacy listed on the prescription. I didn't announce myself. I didn't accuse anyone. I asked questions the way my job had trained me to politely, precisely. The pharmacist was cautious, professional. "I can't discuss patient details," she said as expected. "I understand," I replied. "I just want to confirm whether this medication requires a specialist's authorization at this dosage." She paused. Just long enough. "Yes," she said carefully. "It typically does. Would that authorization come from a primary care physician?" I asked. Another pause. "Not usually." I thanked her and left without another word. Back in my car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly until my pulse steadied. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sick. When I returned home, Emily and Margaret were reviewing paperwork at the dining table again. Daniel sat nearby, silent, his eyes dull. "Everything okay?" Emily asked. "Yes," I said. "Just errands." Margaret smiled, satisfied. That afternoon, Daniel had a reaction to his medication. Not dramatic. Just unsettling. Dizziness. Slurred speech. He struggled to focus his eyes. Emily reassured everyone. It was normal, temporary, adjustment-related. Margaret agreed immediately. I said nothing. Instead, I documented it. Time, symptoms, dosage. That night, I sat alone in the guest room and opened a new folder on my computer. I scanned copies of prescriptions when I could. I photographed medication bottles. I saved emails. I didn't know yet what I would do with the information. I only knew I needed it. Emily began limiting my access further without openly saying so. She'd tell me Daniel was resting and shouldn't be disturbed. She'd offer to handle tasks I'd always done before. Margaret supported every boundary she set. "You should trust her," Margaret told me gently one afternoon. "This isn't personal. But it was. It became clear that I was no longer seen as part of Daniel's care team. I was the emotional variable, the wife who might complicate things, the person best kept at a distance. And still I waited. Not because I was afraid, but because I was learning. Learning how easily concern could be weaponized, how authority could be borrowed, how silence once established could be used to erase someone without raising suspicion. I watched my husband fade and told myself that when I finally spoke, it would be with certainty, not emotion. With evidence, not fear. For now, I stayed quiet. But I was no longer uninvolved. The first time I truly understood how far I had been pushed out of my own marriage was the morning I realized I no longer knew my husband's full medication list. I was standing in the kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hand, staring at the refrigerator where Emily's neatly typed schedule used to hang. It was gone. In its place was a smaller version, handwritten with abbreviations I didn't recognize. When I asked Emily about it, she didn't even look up from her notebook. "I simplified it," she said. "Too much information can be confusing." "For who?" I asked. She finally met my eyes, calm and steady. "For everyone." Margaret arrived shortly after carrying a paper bag from a bakery Daniel used to love. She kissed his forehead, asked Emily how the night had gone, and didn't ask me anything at all. It was as if the hierarchy had been silently rewritten, and everyone else had received the memo except me. Daniel barely touched the pastries. He sat at the table, shoulders slumped, eyes unfocused, pushing crumbs around with his finger. When I asked him how he felt, he shrugged. "Tired," he said. "Just foggy." Emily stepped in immediately. "That's expected. His body's adjusting." Margaret nodded. "Healing takes patience." Patience. That word again. As the days passed, Daniel's world continued to shrink. He stopped checking his phone altogether. Messages from coworkers went unanswered. His laptop gathered dust on the desk in the living room. When his supervisor emailed asking for updates, Emily responded for him, copying Margaret but not me. I only found out because I happened to glance at Daniel's inbox when paying bills one evening. That was when I realized something else had changed. The bank notifications were different. At first I thought it was a formatting issue. Then I looked closer. Transactions I didn't recognize. Transfers labeled as medical expenses that were larger than expected. When I asked Margaret about them, she waved it off. "Insurance delays," she said. "Reimbursements will come later." Emily added, "Healthcare is complicated. You know that." I did know that. That was exactly why I was uneasy. I began cross-referencing everything. Medication costs, insurance coverage, out-of-pocket limits. The numbers didn't align. Not dramatically enough to accuse anyone, but enough to raise quiet alarms. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed to drift further away from me emotionally. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He simply stopped confiding in me. When I tried to talk to him alone, he grew anxious, glancing toward the hallway as if expecting interruption. "Why do you keep asking so many questions?" he asked me one night, his voice strained. "They're just trying to help." I swallowed the urge to defend myself. "I'm trying to understand." "There's nothing to understand," he said, turning away. "You're overthinking this." That was the moment I realized how thoroughly the narrative had been turned against me. I was no longer the wife concerned about her husband's health. I was the anxious presence, the emotional variable, the one who complicated recovery. Emily and Margaret had positioned themselves as calm, rational, essential, and Daniel, exhausted and medicated, accepted that framing without resistance. The next prescription arrived 3 days later. I saw it before anyone else did, tucked into a pharmacy bag on the counter. Same medication class, higher dosage, different prescribing physician again. This time I took a photo before putting it back. When I compared the signature to the previous one, my stomach dropped. The names were different, but the handwriting was nearly identical. That wasn't a coincidence. That evening, Daniel had another episode. His speech slowed noticeably. He struggled to form sentences, frustration flashing briefly across his face before fading into resignation. Emily adjusted the dosage again without consulting anyone else. "This is within protocol," she said when I questioned it. Margaret stood beside her, arms crossed. "You need to stop undermining her, Claire." "I'm not undermining anyone," I replied quietly. "I'm asking questions." "And that's the problem," Margaret said, her tone sharper now. "You're creating stress." Daniel looked between us, confused, then closed his eyes. "Please," he said softly. "Just stop." I did. That night I slept in the guest room again. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the day in my mind, organizing facts the way I always did when things felt out of control. Facts didn't argue back. Facts didn't gaslight. The next morning I called a lawyer. Not a dramatic call, not an emergency. I framed it as a general inquiry about medical decision-making and spousal rights. The attorney listened, patiently asked measured questions. "Are you listed as your husband's medical power of attorney?" she asked. "I was," I said. "At least I thought I was." "That's something you should verify immediately," she replied, "especially if others are making decisions on his behalf." I thanked her and ended the call with my hands shaking slightly. When I asked Emily for copies of Daniel's medical directives, she hesitated for the first time. "I'll have to check," she said. Margaret intervened quickly. "This is unnecessary." "No," I said, my voice still calm. "It's not." That was the first time I felt them both really look at me, not as an inconvenience, not as an emotional liability, but as someone who might not stay quiet forever. The tension in the house shifted after that. Conversations stopped abruptly when I entered rooms again. Emily became more guarded. Margaret watched me with renewed focus, as if reassessing. Daniel, however, grew worse. His confusion deepened. His coordination faltered. He began sleeping almost constantly. When awake, he was distant, sometimes irritable, sometimes eerily calm. I documented everything. Every symptom. Every change. One afternoon, while Emily was out and Margaret was on the phone in another room, I sat beside Daniel and took his hand. "Do you trust me?" I asked softly. He frowned, as if the question itself was difficult. "Of course," he said, but there was hesitation there. Uncertainty. I felt something break inside my chest. That night, I reviewed everything I'd collected so far. Prescriptions, dosages, signatures, financial discrepancies, timelines. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone yet, but it was enough to prove a pattern. And patterns, once established, are hard to deny. I didn't know how this would end. I didn't know how much worse it would get before someone with real authority intervened. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If I didn't act soon, my silence would no longer be interpreted as patience. It would be recorded as neglect. The morning everything crystallized began like all the others, quiet, controlled, carefully managed by people who no longer included me in their definition of family. Daniel was still asleep when I woke up. His breathing was shallow but steady, his face pale against the pillow. Emily's car wasn't in the driveway yet. Margaret hadn't arrived. For once, the house belonged to me again, if only briefly. I went straight to the medicine cabinet. I didn't rummage. I didn't panic. I opened it the way I always had, slow and deliberate, as if muscle memory alone could protect me from what I might find. The bottles were arranged neatly, labels facing forward. Emily's handwriting marked the caps with dates and times. I took one bottle out and read the label carefully. Then another. Then another. My hands began to shake, not because I didn't understand what I was seeing, but because I understood it too well. The dosages had increased again. Not incrementally this time, but significantly. Enough that any physician following standard protocol would have required additional testing, monitoring, documentation. None of which I had seen. None of which Daniel remembered undergoing. I sat at the kitchen table and laid the bottles out in a row, matching them to the prescriptions I'd photographed over the past week. One by one, the inconsistencies lined up. Different prescribing physicians, similar handwriting, identical formatting quirks, and one glaring detail I hadn't noticed before. The DEA numbers. They were off. Not invalid enough to be rejected automatically, but inconsistent with the issuing state. A detail most people wouldn't catch. A detail I only noticed because my job trained me to notice what others overlooked. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just negligence. This was something else. Emily arrived shortly after, cheerful as ever, greeting Daniel softly as she passed the bedroom. Margaret followed 10 minutes later, carrying her usual air of quiet command. I returned the medication bottles to the cabinet exactly as I'd found them and poured myself a cup of coffee I didn't want. Emily moved confidently through the kitchen, preparing Daniel's morning dose. "I'll take care of it," she said when I reached for the glass of water. I stepped back, watching closely as she measured the pills, her movements precise, practiced. "That seems like more than yesterday," I said calmly. She didn't look up. "It's been adjusted." "By who?" I asked. She paused just long enough for the silence to register. "The prescribing physician." "Which one?" I pressed. Margaret cleared her throat. "Claire, this isn't helpful." Emily finally met my eyes. "We've discussed this. Questioning treatment undermines recovery." I nodded. "Then you won't mind explaining it." Margaret stepped closer, her presence suddenly heavy. "You're being difficult." "No," I said quietly. "I'm being careful." Daniel stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "What's going on?" he asked weakly. "Nothing," Margaret said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." Emily handed him the medication. He took it without question. That was when I realized how close I was to losing him, not emotionally, not symbolically, but literally. He trusted them with his body, his mind, his decisions, and they had no intention of giving that power back. Later that afternoon, Daniel's condition worsened noticeably. His speech slurred more than usual. He struggled to stand without assistance. Emily insisted it was temporary. Margaret agreed. I documented everything. When Daniel fell asleep again, I went to my home office and closed the door. I didn't search online this time. I called the prescribing clinic listed on the latest prescription. I introduced myself as Daniel's wife and asked to confirm an appointment date. The receptionist paused. "I don't see him in our system," she said. I felt my pulse quicken. "Are you sure? The prescription lists your clinic?" She asked for the physician's name. Another pause. "That doctor doesn't practice here anymore," she said slowly. "Not for over a year." I thanked her and hung up my hands, cold despite the warmth of the room. There it was, the line I could no longer ignore. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't overreach. This was fraudulent medical intervention, and my husband was the one paying the price. I called the lawyer again. This time I didn't frame it as a general inquiry. "I believe my husband is being given medication under false prescriptions," I said. "I have documentation." Her tone changed immediately. "You need to stop this now," she said. "And you need witnesses." She instructed me to contact Daniel's primary care physician directly and request an emergency review. She told me to prepare everything. I had photos, notes, timelines. She told me not to confront anyone alone. When I hung up, my heart was racing, but my mind was clear. That evening I told Margaret I was taking Daniel to see his doctor the next day. "That's unnecessary," she said sharply. "Emily is managing his care." "I'm his wife," I replied, "and I'm taking him." Emily watched us both, her expression unreadable. Daniel looked confused. "Do I need to go?" he asked. "Yes," I said gently. "You do." Margaret's voice hardened. "You're overstepping." "No," I said. "I'm stepping in." The tension in the room was suffocating. Emily packed up quietly, avoiding eye contact. Margaret left shortly after, her disappointment palpable. That night I slept lightly, my senses alert to every sound. I knew things would escalate from here. People who operate in shadows don't surrender quietly. The next morning I drove Daniel to his primary care physician myself. No Emily, no Margaret, just us. The doctor reviewed the medications, his expression darkening with every page. "These dosages don't make sense," he said finally. "And I didn't authorize any of this." He ordered immediate tests and referred Daniel to a specialist. He documented everything. He asked pointed questions. For the first time in weeks, someone with real authority was listening to me. As we left the clinic, Daniel squeezed my hand weakly. "I'm scared," he admitted. "So am I," said. "But you're safe now." I didn't know yet how much damage had been done, or how deep Margaret and Emily's involvement truly went. But I knew one thing for certain. The prescription had raised alarms for a reason, and those alarms were about to be heard. The shift didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in measured steps, each one wrapped in politeness, and concern, each one designed to look reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. After Daniel's primary care physician flagged the prescriptions and ordered further tests, I thought the worst part was behind us. I was wrong. Margaret arrived at the house that evening with a composure so controlled it felt rehearsed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse me outright. She simply sat at the dining table, folded her hands, and waited for Emily to arrive. Daniel was resting in the bedroom, exhausted from the tests and the unfamiliar clarity that followed them. The specialist had reduced his medication immediately. Even that small change had left him disoriented and fragile. "We need to talk," Margaret said when Emily stepped inside. I stayed in the room. I didn't ask permission. Margaret's gaze flicked toward me briefly before settling back on Emily. "The doctor visit today was unnecessary," she said. "It created confusion." Emily nodded slowly. "It complicates things." I felt a flash of anger, sharp and sudden, but I kept my voice level. "It clarified things." Margaret smiled thinly. "Claire, you're emotional. Anyone would be in your position. But Daniel needs stability, not conflict." Stability. That word again used like a shield. Emily spoke carefully. The doctor overreacted. That happens when physicians don't have the full context. Then provide the context, I said, including the false prescriptions. The room went quiet. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes hardened. Emily looked down at her hands. This is not the time for accusations, Margaret said. Daniel is vulnerable. And that's exactly why this matters, I replied. Margaret stood. I think it's best if you take some time away. I blinked. Excuse me, just for a few days, she continued smoothly. So Daniel can rest without tension. Emily can stay here and manage his care properly. The audacity of it took my breath away. This is my home, I said. And I'm his wife. Margaret's voice softened, but her words were firm. Not everything needs to be about titles. I understood then that this was no longer about Daniel's health. It was about control, about who had access to him, to his decisions, to his body. I'm not leaving, I said. Margaret looked at Emily. We tried. That night, the isolation became deliberate. Emily insisted Daniel needed uninterrupted rest and limited visitors. Margaret supported her fully. When I tried to sit with him, Emily suggested I step out. When I asked to review updated test results, Margaret said the doctors would handle it. Daniel, still groggy from medication changes, didn't intervene. They're just trying to help, he murmured when I pressed him. Can we not fight? I stopped asking him to choose. Instead, I focused on documenting everything. I installed a small security camera in the hallway outside the bedroom under the pretense of monitoring Daniel's nighttime movements for safety. Emily approved it. Margaret didn't object. They underestimated how much information silence could collect. Over the next 2 days, I watched patterns emerge. Emily administered medications even after the doctor's explicit instructions to pause certain drugs. Margaret questioned every follow-up appointment I scheduled. Phone calls were made without me present. Decisions were framed as doctor-approved without evidence. I recorded it all. On the 3rd day, Daniel had a severe reaction. He collapsed in the bathroom, disoriented and shaking. Emily insisted it was a delayed response to medication withdrawal. Margaret agreed. I called emergency services anyway. The paramedics arrived quickly. They asked questions. They reviewed medications. One of them frowned as he checked the bottles. These don't match the discharge notes, he said quietly. Margaret bristled. We've been managing his care just fine. The paramedic didn't respond to her. He looked at me instead. Ma'am, are you his spouse? Yes, I said. We're taking him in, he said. Now. At the hospital, the tension escalated. Doctors reviewed the medication history I provided. Nurses asked detailed questions. A hospital pharmacist flagged multiple inconsistencies. A social worker appeared asking about decision-making authority and home care arrangements. Margaret tried to assert herself, speaking over me, correcting staff, insisting she had been involved from the beginning. A nurse stopped her gently but firmly. We need to hear from the patient's wife. For the first time, I wasn't the emotional one in the room. I was the source. Emily stayed quiet, her professional composure slipping at the edges. When a physician asked her directly about the prescriptions, she deflected. I followed instructions, she said. From whom, the physician asked. She hesitated. That hesitation was documented. By the end of the night, Daniel was admitted for observation. The hospital restricted outside medication administration. Everything would now go through their system. Margaret was furious. This is excessive, she told me in the hallway. You've blown this out of proportion. I didn't respond. Emily left without saying goodbye. The next morning, a hospital administrator requested a meeting. They reviewed the evidence I'd provided, photos, timelines, recorded observations. They asked about Emily's credentials, Margaret's involvement, and whether I had felt pressured to relinquish care. Yes, I said, repeatedly. The administrator nodded. We're escalating this. By the afternoon, an internal investigation was underway. Risk management, legal review, mandatory reporting protocols. Margaret's access to Daniel was limited. Emily was barred from the hospital pending review. Daniel was confused but improving. Without the unauthorized medications, his speech sharpened slightly. His eyes focused more often. When he looked at me now, there was recognition and fear. I didn't know, he said quietly. I know, I replied, holding his hand. You were trusting people who claimed authority. That evening, a uniformed officer visited the hospital room, not dramatic, not aggressive, just procedural. He asked questions, took notes, requested copies of prescriptions. I watched Margaret from across the room as the reality settled in. This was no longer a family matter. This was a legal one. And for the first time since all of this began, the silence that had protected them was finally working against them. Once the hospital took control of Daniel's care, the house felt different, even empty, though I was still there. The quiet wasn't the tense, watchful silence I'd grown used to. It was the aftermath of a storm, the kind where debris hasn't settled yet and you don't know what's been damaged beneath the surface. I spent most of my time at the hospital. Daniel was improving, slowly, cautiously, under careful supervision. The doctors tapered medications, methodically monitoring every response. It wasn't a miracle recovery. It was something steadier, more honest. His speech sharpened by degrees. His eyes followed conversations again. He asked questions. Sometimes he asked about Emily. I answered carefully, not defensively, not emotionally. I stuck to facts. At home, Margaret's absence was conspicuous. She didn't come by unannounced anymore. She didn't call every evening. When she did reach out, her messages were clipped formal, as if she were documenting everything she said. I knew why. The hospital's internal investigation moved quickly, faster than I expected. They requested additional documentation, and I provided it: security camera, timestamps, photographs, notes, emails. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I let the pattern speak for itself. 3 days after Daniel was admitted, I received a call from a hospital social worker asking if I could come in early. When I arrived, Daniel was asleep. The social worker led me into a small conference room. A hospital administrator and a risk management attorney joined us shortly after. They were polite, direct. "We've identified concerns that go beyond improper home care," the attorney said. "There appears to be a coordinated effort involving unauthorized prescriptions and financial transactions." I felt my throat tighten, but I nodded. I suspected as much. The administrator slid a folder across the table. We subpoenaed pharmacy records. Inside were printouts, dates, amounts, prescriber information. Emily's name appeared repeatedly. So did Margaret's. I flipped through the pages slowly, my hands steady despite the rush of cold spreading through my chest. Emily received payments, the administrator continued, from an account linked to your mother-in-law, labeled as care services. The amounts increased alongside the medication changes. I closed the folder. I didn't need to see more. This wasn't misguided concern. It was an arrangement. Later that afternoon, Daniel woke up clearer than he'd been in weeks. He asked to sit up, asked for water, asked where his mother was. I sat beside him and told him the truth, carefully, piece by piece. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't accuse. I described facts the way I'd learned to, calmly, chronologically. He listened in silence, his brow furrowed. "She wouldn't," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "My mom wouldn't do that." "I didn't want to believe it either," I replied, "but the records are clear." He turned his face toward the window. I let him have the silence. That evening, a detective from the county's financial crimes unit requested an interview. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't raise his voice. He asked precise questions and took detailed notes. When he asked how long I believed the arrangement had been in place, I answered honestly. "Longer than I realized," I said. "But not longer than the prescriptions." He nodded. "We'll verify." The next day, Margaret came to the hospital. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce herself. She simply appeared in the hallway outside Daniel's room, her posture straight, her expression composed. She looked like someone who had practiced being calm in front of mirrors. "I want to see my son," she said to the nurse. The nurse checked the chart. "I'll need to ask his wife." Margaret's gaze flicked to me, sharp, controlled. "I'm here," I said. "And no." Her mouth tightened. "You don't have the right." "I do," I replied. "Legally." We stood there for a long moment, the air between us charged but quiet. Finally, she turned and left without another word. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Emily. I almost didn't answer. "Claire," she said quickly, "this has gone too far." "Has it?" I asked. "You don't understand what Margaret was trying to do," she said. "She was protecting him. By forging prescriptions," I replied. "By over-medicating him," she hesitated. "It wasn't like that." "Then explain it," I said. She didn't. Instead, she said, "You're ruining lives." I ended the call. That night I stayed late at the hospital. Daniel slept peacefully, monitors humming softly beside him. I watched his chest rise and fall, and thought about how close I'd come to losing him, not to illness, but to manipulation wrapped in concern. 2 days later, the authorities searched Emily's apartment. I didn't witness it. I didn't need to. The detective called to inform me that prescription pads, falsified records, and communications with Margaret had been recovered. Enough to establish intent. Enough to move forward. Margaret retained an attorney that same afternoon. Her calls stopped entirely after that. Daniel struggled with the truth. There were moments of anger, moments of denial, moments where grief surfaced unexpectedly. "She was always there for me," he said one evening, tears gathering in his eyes. "She never hurt me." I held his hand. "I know. That's what makes this so hard." The hospital discharged Daniel at the end of the week with strict follow-up care and clear documentation of who was authorized to make decisions. Only me. As we drove home together for the first time in days, the house looked unfamiliar, like a place that had been occupied by strangers. Inside, I began packing away the remnants of Emily's presence. Her notes, her supplies, the handwritten schedules that had once dictated our lives. I didn't throw them away. I boxed them carefully. Evidence matters. Daniel watched quietly from the doorway. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not listening." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone emerging from a fog he hadn't chosen. "We'll deal with that later," I said. "Right now we focus on getting you well." Outside, a car drove past slowly. I wondered if Margaret was inside it watching, calculating her next move. If she was, it didn't matter. The story was no longer hers to control, and the truth, once documented, has a way of standing on its own. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a city after an evacuation, everything familiar but altered in ways that made it impossible to pretend nothing had happened. Daniel's recovery was slow but real. Without the unauthorized medications clouding his mind, his days began to take shape again. He could follow conversations. He asked about work. He noticed when the mail arrived and when the dog barked at the delivery truck down the street. These were small things, but they mattered. They were signs that he was returning to himself. Still, the emotional damage lingered. Some nights he woke up disoriented, heart racing, convinced he'd missed something important or made a decision he couldn't remember. I sat with him until the panic passed, reminding him where he was, what day it was, who he could trust. Trust had become a fragile thing, easily fractured, slow to rebuild. At the same time, the legal process began to gather momentum. The detective assigned to the case contacted me regularly, requesting clarification, additional documentation timelines. I complied with every request. I didn't embellish. I didn't interpret motives. I provided facts, dates, signatures, transfers, messages. Let them draw their own conclusions. Emily was formally charged first. The news came quietly through a phone call from the detective one afternoon while Daniel napped. Multiple counts: fraud, practicing medicine without authorization, falsification of records. The charges were serious and the evidence was extensive. Margaret's situation was more complicated. She hadn't written prescriptions. She hadn't administered medication. She had stayed just far enough from the direct actions to make everything look like concern rather than orchestration. But money leaves trails. So do messages. So do patterns. Her attorney contacted mine. Yes, I had retained one by then, requesting that all communication go through legal channels. It was an acknowledgement without an apology. Daniel struggled when he learned the full scope of Emily's charges. He went quiet, distant, processing the collapse of a past he'd believed was resolved long ago. "I feel like I failed to protect myself," he said one evening, staring at the living room wall. "You were sick," I replied gently. "And you trusted people who claimed authority. That's not failure." He nodded, but I could tell the guilt had taken root. Margaret attempted to reach out indirectly. A handwritten letter arrived one afternoon addressed to Daniel in careful cursive. He asked me to open it with him. Inside were familiar phrases: love, sacrifice, misunderstanding. She wrote about fear, about wanting to help, about how everything had been taken out of context. There was no mention of prescriptions, no acknowledgement of money, no apology. Daniel folded the letter slowly and set it aside. "She still doesn't see it," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "She sees what she wants to see." The district attorney's office scheduled a preliminary hearing. Not a trial, not yet, but a public step. Subpoenas were issued. Pharmacy representatives were called. Medical professionals prepared statements. The case was no longer abstract. It had names, numbers, dates. Daniel wasn't required to attend, but he chose to. We sat in the courtroom together, not holding hands but close enough to feel each other's presence. Emily sat across the room, smaller than I remembered, her confidence stripped away by the gravity of the situation. She didn't look at us. Margaret arrived last. She walked in with her attorney posture rigid, expression controlled. She avoided Daniel's eyes. When she glanced at me, there was something like disbelief there, as if she still couldn't understand how I'd become part of this story in a way she hadn't anticipated. The hearing was procedural, but the details were laid out plainly. Prescriptions, dosages, payments. The sequence of events that transformed care into coercion. A pharmacist testified about red flags. A physician explained why the medication regimen was dangerous. A financial analyst traced transfers from Margaret's account to Emily's. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Daniel's face drained of color as the timeline unfolded. I watched him absorb it piece by piece, the reality finally too solid to deny. When the judge spoke, her tone was firm and neutral. "There is sufficient evidence to proceed," she said. "This matter will move forward." Margaret didn't react. Emily stared at the table. Outside the courtroom, reporters lingered, but no one approached us. The case wasn't sensational enough for headlines. It didn't need to be. The impact was personal, devastating in quieter ways. At home that evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, his untouched plate cooling in front of him. "She used to make my lunches," he said suddenly. "Every day, even after I graduated college." I waited. "I thought that meant something," he continued. "I thought it meant she'd always take care of me." I chose my words carefully. Sometimes care becomes control when people are afraid to let go. He nodded slowly. As the weeks passed, the house became ours again. I removed the last of Emily's supplies. I replaced the medication cabinet with one approved by Daniel's doctors. We established routines together, slow walks, simple meals, shared decisions. Margaret's access was formally restricted through a temporary protective order related to the investigation. Daniel agreed to it without argument. That more than anything told me how deeply things had changed. One afternoon, as I organized paperwork for our attorney, I came across the first prescription I'd ever questioned, the one that had felt wrong without my knowing why. I held it for a long moment before filing it away. That piece of paper had almost cost us everything. Daniel found me there, standing in the doorway of my home office. "I keep thinking about how close this came," he said. "So do I replied. "But you didn't panic," he added. "You didn't scream. You didn't force anything." "I couldn't," I said. "Not if I wanted the truth to hold." He reached for my hand, his grip steady now. "Thank you for staying quiet long enough to be heard." The trial date loomed in the distance, inevitable but not immediate. There would be more hearings, more testimony, more waiting. But the center of gravity had shifted. The truth was no longer something I carried alone. It was documented, scheduled, protected by process. And for the first time since this all began, I slept without listening for footsteps in the hallway. The day of the full hearing arrived quietly without the drama I once imagined justice would require. There were no raised voices, no sudden revelations shouted across the room. Just a courtroom, a schedule, and a record thick enough to make denial impossible. Daniel insisted on attending again. His doctors had cleared him for short periods of stress with conditions. He followed every instruction carefully, as if discipline itself were a way of reclaiming control over his life. We arrived early and sat in the second row. I noticed how different he looked now, still thin, still healing, but present. His eyes tracked movement. His posture was steadier. He was no longer a man being spoken for. Margaret entered with her attorney, her movements deliberate, composed. She wore a muted gray suit and pearl earrings, the same ones she'd worn to our wedding years earlier. Seeing them now made my chest tighten, but I didn't look away. Emily was brought in shortly after. She looked smaller than before, stripped of the quiet authority she'd once carried so easily. She avoided looking in our direction entirely. When proceedings began, the judge reviewed the scope of the case. Charges, jurisdiction, evidence. It was procedural, methodical, no room for emotion. The first witnesses were medical professionals. Daniel's primary care physician testified about the initial diagnosis and the lack of authorization for the medications Emily had administered. He explained in careful detail how the dosages could cause confusion, dependency, and cognitive impairment when used improperly. A hospital pharmacist followed, pointing out inconsistencies in the prescriptions, the irregular DEA numbers, the formatting patterns, the lack of appropriate documentation. Each point landed quietly but firmly. Then came the financial analysis. A forensic accountant traced the payments from Margaret's account to Emily's, correlating them with medication changes and care escalation. The timeline was projected on a screen, each transaction a data point, each gap an implication. Margaret's attorney objected frequently. The judge overruled just as often. When Margaret was called to testify, she stood slowly, her face calm but pale. She spoke about concern, about fear, about wanting to help her son when she felt excluded. She framed every action as protective, every decision as maternal instinct. "I trusted Emily because she had medical experience," Margaret said. "I never intended harm." The prosecutor's questions were precise. "Did you authorize payments to Emily for care services?" "Yes." "Did those payments increase as medication dosages increased?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't recall exact amounts." The prosecutor displayed the bank records. "Do you dispute these transfers?" Margaret's voice faltered for the first time. "No." Emily's testimony followed. She admitted to writing prescriptions under physician names she no longer worked with. She claimed she believed she was helping, that she felt pressure, that she didn't think anyone would get hurt. "Who pressured you?" the prosecutor asked. Emily's eyes flicked toward Margaret before she looked down. "I was encouraged to step in, to stabilize him." Encouraged. That word echoed in the room. When it was my turn to testify, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I didn't speak about betrayal. I didn't speak about fear. I spoke about dates, about observations, about how I noticed the prescriptions didn't align, about the steps I took quietly to verify what I was seeing. The prosecutor asked why I hadn't confronted anyone sooner. "Because confrontation would have made me look emotional," I said. "Documentation made me credible." The judge nodded slightly. Daniel testified last. He spoke slowly, carefully, his voice steady but soft. He described confusion, trust, how his ability to question diminished as medication increased. He spoke about his mother's role in his life, the authority she held, and how difficult it was to imagine her being wrong. "I didn't consent to those medications," he said. "Not fully. I trusted the people around me." When the hearing adjourned for deliberation, the room emptied quietly. Outside, Daniel leaned against the wall, exhausted but resolute. "I feel like I finally know what happened to me," he said. "So do I replied. The judge's ruling came later that afternoon. Emily was ordered to stand trial on all charges. Margaret was named as a co-conspirator in the fraudulent medical scheme, subject to further proceedings. Protective orders were extended. Daniel's medical autonomy was reaffirmed legally, with explicit restrictions on third-party involvement. There was no gavel slam, no dramatic pause, just words recorded and binding. Margaret did not look at us as she left. That evening, we returned home together. The house felt lighter than it had in months. The shadows that once seemed to watch us had retreated. Daniel sat on the couch, quiet. "I don't know what our relationship with her looks like now," he said. "It doesn't have to look like anything yet," I replied. "Healing doesn't follow schedules." He nodded, closing his eyes briefly. Later that night, as I filed the final copies of testimony, I realized something important. Justice hadn't arrived with noise or spectacle. It arrived through process, through patience, through facts laid out so clearly that denial had nowhere to hide. And the woman who had once been told she was too emotional, too involved, too much, had been believed precisely because she stayed quiet long enough to be precise. After the hearing, time began to move differently. Not slower, just heavier. Each day carried the weight of what had already been decided, and the uncertainty of what was still to come. Emily was taken into custody 2 weeks later. There was no dramatic arrest at our doorstep, no flashing lights. I learned about it from a call with the detective assigned to the case. She had turned herself in after her attorney advised cooperation. The evidence was overwhelming. Prescription records, payment trails, messages she couldn't explain away. Daniel listened quietly as I relayed the information. He didn't celebrate. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded once and said, "Okay." Margaret's case moved more slowly. She remained free while her legal team challenged the scope of the charges. Procedural motions, requests for dismissal, attempts to recast her role as peripheral misguided maternal. The words changed, but the facts didn't. Still waiting took its toll. Daniel struggled in ways he hadn't before. Not physically, his recovery continued steadily under proper care, but emotionally. Trust once fractured doesn't simply return, because the truth is acknowledged. It leaves gaps. Doubt seeps into ordinary moments. Sometimes he questioned his own memories. "Did I really agree to that?" he asked me one evening, staring at the medication cabinet as if it might answer him. "You trusted people who presented authority," I said. "That doesn't erase your judgment." It explains why it was overridden. He nodded, but I could see the uncertainty linger. We began couples counseling at his doctor's suggestion, not because our marriage was broken, but because it had been invaded. The therapist framed it that way, and it helped. We weren't rebuilding from neglect or betrayal between us. We were reclaiming ground that had been occupied without consent. Margaret tried once more to reach Daniel directly. She left a voicemail while I was in the kitchen, her voice controlled, trembling just enough to suggest sincerity. "I never meant for this to go so far," she said. "I only wanted to help you. Please call me." Daniel listened to it twice. Then he deleted it. "I need space," he said quietly. "Not punishment, just space." I respected that. The next court date arrived 3 months later, this time focused on Margaret's role. The courtroom was fuller. More attorneys. More observers. The case had expanded, drawing attention from regulatory agencies and elder advocacy groups. The judge reviewed updated filings. The prosecutor laid out additional evidence, emails, text messages, recorded calls, where Margaret discussed medication adjustments and expressed concern about keeping things under control. Control. That word again. Margaret's attorney argued that she lacked medical expertise and relied on Emily's assurances, that she acted out of fear, not malice. The prosecutor countered with bank records and timelines. "Intent doesn't require medical knowledge," he said. "It requires action." When Margaret took the stand again, she appeared smaller than before, still composed but less certain. Her answers grew shorter, less confident. "Did you know Emily was falsifying prescriptions?" the prosecutor asked. Margaret hesitated. "I suspected irregularities. And did you report those concerns?" "No." "Did you continue paying her?" "Yes." Silence filled the room. That silence was louder than any accusation. The judge's ruling came swiftly. Margaret was formally charged with conspiracy to commit medical fraud and financial exploitation. Bail conditions were imposed. Contact with Daniel was prohibited pending trial. There was no reaction from her, no outburst, no plea. As officers escorted her from the courtroom, she glanced toward Daniel for the first time since the case began. He didn't look back. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, sharper. Daniel leaned against the railing, breathing deeply. "I never thought it would end like this," he said. "I don't think anyone does," I replied. "When trust collapses, it rarely does so neatly." The trial date was set months away, but the most important decisions had already been made. The system had acknowledged what had happened. Authority had shifted back where it belonged. At home, life settled into a new rhythm. Daniel returned to work part-time. His employer accommodated his recovery without question. I resumed my normal workload, though my perspective had changed. Documents felt less abstract now. Paperwork had teeth. One afternoon, while sorting old files, I found a photo from our wedding day. Margaret stood between us, smiling, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. The image looked different now, not sinister, just complicated. I showed it to Daniel. "She looks happy," he said. "She probably was," I replied. "People can mean well and still cause harm." He nodded, thoughtful. The day Emily accepted a plea deal, the detective called to inform me. She would serve time. Her license was permanently revoked. Restitution was ordered. I felt no satisfaction, only relief. Relief that the truth had been acknowledged, that Daniel was safe, that the quiet choices I'd made, the notes, the patience, the refusal to be provoked, had held long enough to matter. That evening, Daniel and I sat on the back porch watching the sky darken. "I keep thinking about how easily I dismissed your concerns," he said. "How I let other people speak for me." "You were sick," I said gently. "And you weren't trying to hurt anyone." "I know," he replied. "But I want you to know, I see it now. What you did." I waited. "You didn't fight loudly," he continued. "You didn't demand. You stayed steady. And because of that, when it mattered, people listened." I felt something loosen in my chest. The trial would come. Sentences would be handed down. Consequences would be formalized. But the core of it, the recognition, the restoration of agency, had already happened. Late justice, I had learned, doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives when the person who was once ignored is finally impossible to dismiss. The final ruling came on a gray morning that looked ordinary enough to belong to anyone else's life. Daniel and I arrived early, as we always did now. Not out of fear, but habit. We had learned that preparation was its own kind of safety. He moved more slowly these days, still careful with his energy, but there was strength in the way he walked, measured, deliberate, present. Margaret arrived with her attorney and sat without acknowledging us. I watched her hands rest in her lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. She looked older than I remembered. Not broken, just exposed. When the judge entered, the room rose and fell in unison. The proceedings began without ceremony. No one needed introductions. Everyone knew why they were there. The prosecutor summarized the case one last time, not emotionally, not rhetorically, just facts, prescriptions, payments. The pattern of escalating control masked as care. The risk to Daniel's health, the erosion of his autonomy. Margaret's attorney spoke next, asking for leniency, citing age, fear, family history. He talked about intentions, about how love can become misguided. He avoided the word control. Margaret was given the opportunity to speak. She stood slowly, her voice steady but thin. "I never wanted to hurt my son," she said. "I believed I was helping him when he couldn't help himself. I trusted the wrong person." She glanced briefly at Emily's empty seat, then back at the judge. "I see now that I crossed lines," she continued. "But everything I did came from love." The judge listened without interruption. When it was over, the courtroom waited. The ruling was firm and measured. Margaret was found guilty on all counts related to conspiracy and exploitation. The sentence was not theatrical. No dramatic language. Probation with strict conditions. Financial penalties. Mandatory restitution. A permanent protective order limiting contact with Daniel unless he chose otherwise. Emily's sentence, already accepted through the plea agreement, was reaffirmed. The judge concluded with a statement that stayed with me long after we left the room. "Care that removes consent is not care," she said. "It is control." And that was it. No applause, no gasps, just the quiet finality of a process completed. Outside, Daniel stood still for a long moment as if waiting for something else to happen. Then he exhaled slowly. "I feel lighter," he said, "and heavier at the same time." I understood exactly what he meant. We didn't speak on the drive home. We didn't need to. The silence between us no longer felt dangerous. It felt earned. At home, the house welcomed us back the way it hadn't in months. Not because anything had changed physically, but because the tension that once lived in its walls was gone. The air moved freely again. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and looked around as if seeing the space for the first time. "I want to make decisions together again," he said. "Even the small ones." I smiled. "Especially the small ones." Over the next few weeks, life didn't magically return to what it had been before. Healing doesn't work that way. But it did become honest. Daniel continued therapy, medical and emotional. I continued my work. We rebuilt routines, slowly, deliberately. Trust wasn't assumed anymore. It was practiced. Margaret didn't reach out again. Not because she wasn't allowed to, though the restrictions were clear, but because Daniel hadn't invited her to. That choice belonged to him now, fully. One afternoon, months later, I found the last box of documents tucked away in the back of my closet. Prescriptions. Notes, copies of emails, evidence that once carried fear and urgency. I held the first prescription again, the one that had raised alarms before I could name them. It looked so ordinary. I sealed the box and labeled it carefully, then placed it on a high shelf. Not as a reminder of trauma, but as proof of survival. Daniel came up behind me, resting his hand lightly on my shoulder. "Do you ever wish you'd spoken up sooner?" he asked. I thought about it. "No," I said. "If I had, they would have dismissed me. I needed them to underestimate me long enough for the truth to stand on its own." He nodded, thoughtful. "You won by not fighting." "I won by waiting," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." That evening we sat on the porch again, watching the light fade. The world moved on around us, cars passing, neighbors walking dogs, ordinary lives continuing. I thought about how close I'd come to being erased from my own story, how easily silence can be mistaken for weakness, how dangerous it is when authority goes unquestioned. But I also thought about something else, how powerful it is to stay still when others expect noise, to gather truth instead of shouting pain, to let systems work when people try to bend them. Late justice doesn't arrive early enough to spare you fear, but it arrives in time to restore your footing. If you've ever been the quiet one in the room, the person whose concerns were brushed aside because they weren't loud enough, dramatic enough, convenient enough, know this. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. And sometimes the person who was once told to step back is the only one left standing when the truth finally comes into the light. Thank you for listening to this story. If it made you pause, reflect, or recognize something in your own life, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories of quiet resilience and late justice matter to you, consider subscribing. You're always welcome here.